Two brothers stood in the same hunting camp in Montana last October, and they were not arguing about the elk. They were arguing about the rifle. One of them carries a .270 Winchester, the cartridge his grandfather carried, the cartridge that put meat in the family freezer for 3 generations. The other carries a 6.5 Creedmoor, a cartridge that did not exist when their grandfather was alive. Built originally not for hunting at all, but for a target shooting competition most hunters have never heard of. They have had this argument before. They will have it again. And here is the thing. Neither of them has ever been told plainly by the magazines, the forums, or the manufacturers who profit from the argument continuing. They are both right, and the fight itself was never actually necessary. The 6.5 Creedmoor versus the .270 Winchester is one of the most heavily debated rivalries in modern American hunting, generating more forum arguments, more magazine cover stories, and more contentious comment sections than almost any other topic in the firearms world. And underneath nearly all of it sits a manufactured binary, a false choice sold to hunters by an industry that has every financial incentive to keep the argument alive. Because an argument sells magazines and drives clicks in a way that the boring truth never will. The boring truth is that these two cartridges have more in common than either side of the argument wants to admit, and the men who actually needed them both settled the argument decades ago, quietly, in the field, long before the internet ever turned it into a war. Tonight, we are going to tell you what the argument actually is, and who actually benefits from keeping it going. To understand this rivalry honestly, you have to understand where each side of it actually came from. And the .270 side of the story starts with a man who did not design the cartridge, but who spent 30 years making sure nobody would ever forget it. The .270 Winchester was introduced by the engineering department at Winchester itself in 1925, a case built by necking down the larger 30-03 military cartridge to accept a smaller, faster bullet. It was a genuine engineering achievement in its own right, flat-shooting and effective across a wide range of game. But for its first 15 years, it was simply one of several new cartridges competing for attention in a crowded American market. What changed its fortunes was not further engineering. It was a writer. Jack O'Connor became the arms editor of Outdoor Life in the 1940s and held that position for more than 3 decades. And across those decades, he became, by wide consensus, the single most influential gun writer in American history. He hunted the .270 across 4 continents, on sheep in the Yukon, on game across Africa and Asia, and he wrote about it constantly, consistently, and with a conviction that never wavered. By the time his career wound down, the .270, Winchester was not simply a cartridge. It was, in the minds of an entire generation of American hunters, the correct answer to nearly every big game hunting question that could be asked. That is the man this half of the story belongs to, not because he invented anything, but because he built something arguably more durable than an invention. He built a tradition, a settled cultural consensus among American hunters about what a proper, all-around big game rifle looked like, and that consensus held largely unchallenged for the better part of 60 years. The other half of this story belongs to a very different kind of man, and he does not have a household name the way O'Connor does. He is the competitive long-range shooter of the early 2000s, a serious, technically minded marksman competing in disciplines like NRA, high-power competition, where success is measured in inches at distances the average deer hunter never shoots at, and where the wrong cartridge choice, one with excessive recoil or a bullet shape that loses stability at extreme range, could cost a match regardless of how skilled the shooter was. That competitive community had a specific, narrow, technical problem that the .270 was never designed to solve, and was never trying to solve. They needed a cartridge, built specifically around the modern high ballistic coefficient bullets that had become available by the mid-2000s that could deliver superior long-range accuracy and reduced wind drift in a mild, recoiling, efficient case that would not beat up a shooter across a full day of competition, firing hundreds of rounds. Hornady, working with contributions from ballistician Dave Emery and competitive shooter Dennis DeMille, built exactly that cartridge and released it in 2007 as the 6.5 Creedmoor. And for its first several years, it lived almost entirely inside that narrow competitive world, exactly as intended, solving exactly the problem it was built to solve. Neither man, the traditionalist hunter shaped by 3 decades of writing from O'Connor, nor the competitive shooter who needed a better target cartridge, was ever actually in conflict with the other. They were solving completely different problems. The war between them was invented later, and by someone else entirely. Here is where the actual lie enters the story, and it did not come from Winchester, and it did not come from Hornady. It came from the layer of the industry that exists between the manufacturers and the hunter, the gun magazines, the online forums, and eventually the video platforms that discovered, somewhere in the 2010s, that a genuine rivalry drives more engagement than a shared truth ever could. Once the 6.5 Creedmoor began appearing in hunting rifles rather than purely competition rifles, sometime in the early 2010s, gun writers and content creators faced an obvious commercial opportunity. A new cartridge with genuinely impressive competition credentials had just arrived in the hunting world, and the traditional, deeply entrenched 270 Winchester was sitting right there as the obvious foil. Framing the story as an old guard versus new guard conflict, tradition against innovation, was simply a more compelling piece of content than the more accurate and considerably less exciting truth, which was that both cartridges were excellent general-purpose hunting rounds with substantial ballistic overlap. The magazines ran the covers. Which cartridge is really better? The 270 is obsolete. The Creedmoor is overhyped, old versus new, and the traffic followed, because an argument with 2 clear sides and passionate defenders on each generates exactly the kind of engagement that content built around genuine consensus never does. This is not a wild accusation aimed at any single publication. It is a pattern that has repeated across the entire firearms media ecosystem for over a decade, driven by an incentive structure that rewards conflict regardless of whether the underlying technical reality actually supports it. And this channel has watched that same incentive structure distort cartridge coverage again and again across different rivalries and different eras. What actually got lost in the manufactured rivalry was the honest technical picture, and it is worth stating plainly here before the technical section develops it fully. In the vast majority of practical North American big game hunting situations, the ballistic difference between a 270 Winchester and a 6.5 Creedmoor loaded with comparable modern bullets is genuinely marginal. Both are capable, flat-shooting, moderate recoiling cartridges suitable for deer, antelope, and most Western big game out to distances the overwhelming majority of hunters will actually shoot at. Neither cartridge represents a dramatic functional upgrade over the other for the hunter standing in a tree stand or glassing a hillside for mule deer. But marginal was never going to sell a magazine cover or drive a video to 1 million views. So the industry sold the difference as larger than it actually was, in both directions, depending on which side of the content was being produced. Traditionalist writers overstated the continued superiority of the 270 in ways that ignored genuine advances in modern bullet technology available for the Creedmoor. Newer content creators overstated the practical hunting advantages of the Creedmoor in ways that borrowed heavily from its genuine but largely irrelevant to most hunters competition shooting pedigree at extreme distance. Both sides were, in their own way, telling hunters a version of the truth stretched just far enough to generate the argument that kept the content cycle running. And the hunter caught in the middle, the man standing in that Montana camp with his brother, absorbed both narratives from different sources across years of reading and watching, and eventually found himself defending a position that had been shaped as much by which content creators he happened to follow as by any careful, independent technical analysis of what his own hunting actually required. That is the actual betrayal in this story. Not a company lying about its own product. An entire layer of the industry dependent on engagement and attention rather than ammunition sales, manufacturing, and sustaining a rivalry that served its own commercial interests far more than it ever served the hunter trying to make an honest decision about which rifle to buy. And it is worth naming exactly why this particular incentive structure is so effective, because it explains why the rivalry has proven so durable. A magazine or a channel that simply tells its audience the truth that two good cartridges exist and either one will serve most hunters well has nothing left to say after that first honest sentence. There is no second video, no follow-up article, no ongoing series to produce. But a manufactured rivalry never runs out of material. There is always a new angle, a new test, a new hunter who switched sides, a new piece of anecdotal field evidence that can be framed as proof one cartridge is finally winning the war. The economics of content production rewarded the lie not because anyone sat down and decided to deceive hunters, but because the truth was a dead end and the argument was a renewable resource. Here are the actual numbers stated plainly, because this is exactly where the manufactured rivalry falls apart under real scrutiny. The 270 Winchester, in a standard modern factory loading with a 130-grain bullet, leaves the muzzle at approximately 3,000 feet per second, carrying substantial energy well past 300 yards, and delivering a notably flat trajectory that made it legendary among mountain hunters taking longer shots across open western terrain. The 6.5 Creedmoor, in a comparable modern factory loading with a 140-grain bullet, leaves the muzzle at a more modest 2,700 feet per second. But that lower starting velocity tells an incomplete story, because the 6.5 bullet is considerably more aerodynamically efficient than the bullets typically loaded in the 270, carrying a meaningfully higher ballistic coefficient that lets it retain velocity and resist wind drift more effectively as range increases. Run both cartridges out to 400 yards, a distance the overwhelming majority of hunters using either cartridge will never actually shoot at, and the trajectories and retained energy figures end up remarkably close, with each cartridge holding a real but modest advantage in different specific categories. The 270 typically carries more raw energy at any given range. The Creedmoor typically drifts less in a crosswind and often produces more consistent accuracy in factory ammunition, a genuine legacy of its competition shooting origins where extreme accuracy was the entire design brief. Recoil tells a similarly balanced story. The 6.5 Creedmoor generates meaningfully less recoil than the 270 Winchester in comparably weighted rifles, a real and practical advantage for hunters sensitive to felt recoil, including many newer hunters and hunters who shoot smaller framed rifles. That is a genuine, documented, non-marginal difference, and it is one of the few places in this entire comparison where one cartridge holds a clear, unambiguous practical edge over the other for a specific and significant portion of the hunting population. But recoil sensitivity is not universal, and for the hunter who does not find the recoil of the 270 objectionable, that advantage simply does not apply, which is precisely the kind of individual, situational factor that a manufactured binary rivalry has no room for. The honest, technical picture is not two cartridges locked in mortal combat. It is two cartridges with genuinely overlapping capability, each holding specific, real, but narrow advantages in specific, narrow categories suited to specific hunters and specific situations rather than to one universal correct answer that either side of the debate wants to claim. On killing power for standard North American big game, deer, antelope, black bear, and most elk hunting scenarios within normal hunting ranges, both cartridges, loaded with appropriate modern hunting bullets, are fully capable, and the difference between them is simply not the deciding factor in whether an animal is cleanly and ethically taken. Bullet placement, bullet construction, and hunter skill determine that outcome far more decisively than which of these two cartridges happens to be chambered in the rifle. That is the finding that never makes a compelling magazine cover, and it is the finding that both traditionalist writers defending the 270 and newer content creators promoting the Creedmoor have had every commercial incentive to downplay for over a decade. A headline that reads, "Both cartridges are excellent, and the choice mostly comes down to personal preference, and available ammunition generates a fraction of the engagement of a headline that reads, "One of these cartridges is dying and the other is killing it," even when the second headline is considerably less accurate than the first. There is one more figure worth putting on the table plainly, because it undercuts a specific claim that circulates constantly in this debate. The notion that the Creedmoor represents some categorical leap in accuracy potential over the 270 does not hold up under careful scrutiny either. Both cartridges, in a well-built modern rifle with quality ammunition, are capable of genuinely excellent accuracy, often well under an inch at 100 yards. The Creedmoor holds a real edge in the consistency of factory match-grade loadings specifically, because it was born from a competition shooting culture that demanded exactly that kind of consistency from the beginning, but a 270 built and loaded with the same care produces results that most hunters and most game animals could never meaningfully distinguish from a Creedmoor doing the same job. Here is what the manufactured rivalry actually cost the hunters caught inside it. Real money changed hands based on an argument that didn't need to happen. Hunters who owned perfectly capable 270 rifles, some inherited from fathers and grandfathers, sold them or set them aside to buy a Creedmoor because years of content consumption had convinced them their existing rifle was somehow falling behind, when in practical field terms it was not falling behind anything at all. Other hunters, committed traditionalists who had absorbed the opposite narrative, dismissed the Creedmoor as a fad or a gimmick without ever actually evaluating whether its genuine advantages, particularly the meaningfully reduced recoil, might have made it a better practical choice for their own specific situation, their own physical build, or a spouse or child they were trying to introduce to hunting with a rifle that kicked less. Family arguments happened over this, genuinely, repeatedly, across hunting camps throughout the American West and Midwest, the kind of good-natured but occasionally sharp disagreement that the two brothers in the cold open represent honestly. Fathers who had built their entire hunting identity around the 270 sometimes struggled to understand sons who wanted to hunt with something different, reading generational rejection into a decision that was often nothing more than a hunter choosing a cartridge with less recoil or better factory match-grade ammunition availability. And underneath all of that individual cost sits a broader one that belongs to the hunting community as a whole. Every hour spent arguing about which of these two genuinely excellent cartridges is objectively superior was an hour not spent on conversations that might have actually mattered more. Marksmanship practice, ethical shot placement, conservation, or simply getting more people into the field regardless of what was chambered in their rifle. the manufactured binary did not just cost individual hunters money and unnecessary conflict. It absorbed attention and energy that the broader hunting community could have spent on genuinely more important questions, redirected instead into a rivalry that served content engagement metrics far more than it ever served hunters themselves. There is also a quieter cost that deserves mention, because it says something about how modern hunters form their opinions. A hunter deciding between these two cartridges today is far more likely to have his decision shaped by which YouTube channels and online forums he happens to follow than by any careful, independent evaluation of his own specific hunting needs. And that is true regardless of which side of the argument he ultimately lands on. The industry didn't simply sell a rivalry. It shaped, for an entire generation of hunters, the actual mental framework through which cartridge decisions get made, replacing independent field-tested judgment, the kind Jack O'Connor built his entire reputation on, with content-driven tribal identity. That is not a small thing, and it is a pattern this channel expects to see repeat with the next cartridge some manufacturer introduces and some content ecosystem decides to frame as a threat to tradition, because the commercial incentives that created this particular manufactured rivalry have not gone anywhere and show no sign of changing. The next new cartridge to enter the American hunting market will almost certainly be met with the exact same treatment, framed within its first year as either a revolution that finally makes everything before it obsolete, or a gimmick unworthy of serious attention from any real hunter, because those are the only two framings that reliably generate the engagement the modern content ecosystem depends on. A calm, accurate assessment of the actual, specific, narrow advantages a new cartridge offers has never once gone viral, and there is no reason to expect that pattern to change simply because this particular rivalry eventually cools down. So who won this fight? Nobody, because the fight itself was never real in the way it was sold. The .270 Winchester remains an excellent, proven, flat-shooting big-game cartridge with nearly a century of field success behind it, exactly as capable today as it was when Jack O'Connor was writing about it in the pages of Outdoor Life. The 6.5 Creedmoor remains a genuinely well-engineered cartridge born from a legitimate competitive shooting need that turned out to translate remarkably well into hunting applications, particularly for hunters who value reduced recoil and consistent factory match-grade accuracy. Both cartridges are still in production. Both are still selling well. Neither has displaced the other, and the honest reason neither has displaced the other is that neither one was ever actually trying to solve a problem the other one already solved perfectly well. The real story here is not a rivalry. It is a demonstration of how a genuinely healthy, boring, mutually beneficial coexistence between two good products got reframed by an industry layer with a direct financial interest in conflict into a war that generated a decade of magazine covers, forum arguments, and video content at a real cost to hunters who spent money, energy, and family goodwill fighting a battle that the actual ballistics never required them to fight. Jack O'Connor spent 30 years building a genuine, earned, field-tested consensus about what made a good all-around cartridge. The modern content ecosystem spent roughly a decade unwinding that consensus, not because the underlying hunting reality had actually changed all that much, but because a settled consensus does not generate engagement the way active, ongoing conflict does. If there is a lesson underneath this particular story, it is one that applies well beyond these two specific cartridges. The next time an entire industry seems unusually invested in convincing you that you must choose a side, it is worth asking directly who actually benefits from you believing the choice matters as much as you are being told it does. Sometimes the answer is a company protecting a legitimate competitive advantage. And sometimes, as it was here,